Story 1. The sound of knocking on the classroom door. It started out as nothing more than an ordinary day. The kind of Friday afternoon in biology class that everyone thought would drag endlessly until the final bell. The mood in the room was unusually light, though, because tomorrow the students were leaving for a long-awaited field trip. Backpacks were half-zipped. Notebooks were mostly ignored, and the teacher seemed more relaxed than usual. In the back row, whispers about snacks and travel plans floated through the air, blending with the faint scratching of pens. Everything pointed to a predictable ending to a predictable week. Then, without warning, the entire atmosphere shifted. Time, 2:95. Son. The crackling sound of the school intercom broke the calm, and a voice, sharp, strained, and uncharacteristically urgent, echoed through the classroom. This is not a drill. All teachers, lock your doors immediately. At first, a few students laughed nervously, assuming it was some kind of mistake or maybe even a poorly timed prank. Yet the tremor in the announcer's tone silenced the room almost instantly. The teacher's expression hardened, and the casual chatter that had filled the space only seconds earlier disappeared into a suffocating silence. Moving quickly, but with controlled urgency, the teacher snapped the lock on the door, dimmed the light, time 0.65, and gestured for everyone to gather in the far corner of the room. The scraping of desks against the tiled floor seemed unbearably loud, every sound exaggerated by the tension building in the air. Some students looked around in disbelief, waiting for a sign that this was all just an error. Others already clutched their phones with shaking hands, eyes darting nervously toward the door as if expecting it to open at any second. The change from carefree anticipation to raw fear was almost immediate, and it forced everyone to confront the reality of how quickly safety can feel like an illusion. The logical question, what could possibly be happening outside the classroom, grew heavier with each passing second. Was there a threat inside the building? Was someone hurt? The uncertainty alone was powerful enough to freeze every thought except one. Stay quiet. Stay hidden, and hope that the next announcement would bring relief rather than panic. The classroom sank into darkness the moment the lights were switched off, and the once familiar walls seemed to close in tighter than ever before. Every sound was amplified in that heavy silence, the shuffle of sneakers against the linoleum floor, the faint hum of air still trapped in the vents, even the shallow breathing of students pressed shoulder to shoulder in the corner. The teacher raised a finger to his lips, urging absolute quiet. But tension already filled the room, like a suffocating weight. Then it began. From the hallway, sound emerged, slow, deliberate, and unnatural. Footsteps, dragging across the floor, scraping in a rhythm that seemed designed to unnerve. The steps were not rushed. They carried no sense of panic. Instead, they echoed with intention, as if whoever was outside wanted the silence inside the classroom to break under the pressure of waiting. The dragging grew louder, closer, until it stopped right outside the door. A moment passed, then came the knocking. It wasn't loud or frantic. It was light, almost casual, but that subtle rhythm carried far more menace than a violent pounding ever could. Each knock felt like a message. I know you're here. I know you're listening. And then, through the wooden barrier, came the whisper. Low, rasping, just loud enough to cut through the silence. Open the door. I know you're in there. Two students stifled gasps, one burying her face into her friend's shoulder, Another trembling so hard the floor beneath seemed to vibrate. No one moved. No one dared. The teacher tightened his grip on the door handle, holding it firm as if his own strength could serve as the final line of defense. Seconds stretched into eternity as the knocking continued, moving from gentle taps to sharper rap. Time, about 9/5. The whisper came again, now less patient, more insistent. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound faded. Footsteps drifted away, retreating down the hall, leaving behind only the weight of unanswered questions. When the lockdown ended hours later, relief swept through the building, but fear lingered. Students whispered to each other long after, piecing together theories and rumors. A few days later, word spread that the police had discovered a homeless man hiding in the school's instrument storage room. He had been living there in secret, surviving unnoticed. And when they searched him, they found a small fruit knife tucked in his pocket. The logic of it all was chilling. He hadn't been a random passerby. He had been inside, waiting, blending into the edges of the school where no one thought to look. The realization carried a deeper truth. The thin line between safety and danger can vanish in an instant. And sometimes the scariest threats are the ones that don't announce themselves with chaos, but with a whisper. Story 2. Shadows of people outside the schoolyard. It was a gray winter afternoon, the kind of day when the sky seemed heavy with rain that never quite arrived. Inside the cafeteria, students sat huddled around crowded tables, their trays clattering with half-finished lunches. The air buzzed with the usual chatter, complaints about homework, plans for the weekend, whispers about who was sitting with whom. The dim light from the overcast sky filtered through the windows, painting everything in a muted, almost lifeless tone. It was ordinary, even boring, until the sound that changed everything pierced the air. A siren wailed outside, sharp and immediate, cutting through the cafeteria noise like a blade. At first, a few students turned their heads casually, curious but unconcerned. But then, the doors burst open and campus security rushed in, their faces marked with urgence, time, done. Their voices echoed off the walls as they shouted, "Lock the doors. Everyone, into the gym now." The shift from routine to chaos was instantaneous. Trays of food hit the floor as students scrambled to gather their belongings. The steady rain outside only added to the confusion, its rhythm against the glass blending with the hurried footsteps inside. Some children hesitated, glancing toward the windows as if trying to see what threat might be lurking beyond, while others pushed forward, driven only by the need to obey. Teachers and staff lined the exits, directing the crowd with firm gestures, their own nerves hidden behind a mask of authority. The transition from cafeteria to gymnasium felt endless. Hallways that had seemed so familiar suddenly carried an unfamiliar way. Time, 0.65 assises. Every corner shadowed by the possibility of danger. What exactly was happening? Was it an intruder, an accident, or something worse? That single unanswered question pressed on everyone's mind as they hurried inside the gym. By the time the last door was locked and the echoes of hurried footsteps died down, silence filled the space. The logical sense of safety should have returned, but instead, the uncertainty only deepened. They knew they were safer behind locked doors, yet the mystery outside was far more terrifying than what they could see within. Inside the gymnasium, the air grew thick with tension. Hundreds of students pressed shoulder to shoulder, their whispers colliding in a low, anxious murmur. Teachers moved quickly to draw the heavy curtains across the glass doors, blocking out the gray light from outside. Time 95s. The room, normally a place of noise and activity, now felt like a sealed container, stifling, silent, and fragile. Yet no amount of fabric could fully hide the unknown beyond the windows. Through the narrow gap in one curtain, a few students caught sight of something that froze their breath. A figure moved slowly along the outer fence of the school, pacing with deliberate steps. In his hands, he carried what looked like a metal rod, glinting faintly in the wet winter air. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicked. Instead, he walked in slow circles, stopping now and then to lean forward, peering in, as if searching for eyes behind the glass. Those who saw him swore later that he was smiling, not with warmth, but with something unsettling, a smile that seemed to stretch too far and linger too long. The whispers inside the gym grew sharper. One student, pale and trembling, shared what she knew. She had seen this man before, often loitering near the bus stop after school. He muttered to himself, incoherent phrases that sounded half like prayers, half like threats. Security had chased him away more than once, but he always returned, drifting around the edges of campus like a shadow that refused to disappear. Her story didn't end there. Months earlier, after being confronted by staff, he had scrawled strange chalk symbols on the brick wall near the main gate. Circles, arrows, and words no one could quite decipher. Markings that seemed obsessive, almost ritualistic. Some laughed it off at the time, dismissing him as nothing more than a harmless eccentric. But now, with that same man visible again, holding a weapon-like rod, the memory took on a far darker weight. Hours passed before the lockdown was lifted. When police finally confirmed the threat, relief rippled through the building, but it was shallow. The officers explained that the man had no firearm, only a hollow metal pipe, and that he was removed without incident. To them, it was resolved, a situation contained. But to the students who had glimpsed his face, the terror lingered. Because it wasn't the object in his hands that left the deepest scar. It was the way he stared through the glass, eyes wide, smile fixed, as if he found joy in the fear he caused. That expression etched itself into memory, a reminder that sometimes danger isn't measured by the weapon carried, but by the intent behind a gaze that refuses to look away. Story 3. Strangers in the Library. He was only a few weeks into his internship at the school library, a young assistant eager to prove himself. Time 0.95s. Most afternoons, long after the final bell had rung, he stayed behind to organize stacks of books that never seemed to find their proper shelves. The library was vast, its rows of tall bookcases stretching out like quiet corridors. In the dim glow of aging fluorescent lights, shadows stretched between the aisles, giving the room a stillness that felt both peaceful and uneasy. That routine afternoon was supposed to be no different. He had just finished sorting a pile of history books when the intercom suddenly cracked to life. The voice that followed was sharp, urgent, and without hesitation. Emergency lockdown. Secure all classrooms immediately. There is an intruder on campus. For a moment, the words didn't seem real. They hung in the air, suspended between disbelief and dread. He looked around instinctively, but the reality pressed in. He was alone. The heavy silence of the library, once comforting, now felt suffocating. Every flicker of the overhead Lights seemed threatening, every creak in the wooden shelves suddenly magnified. He pulled out his phone, debating whether to call someone, but remembered the rule. During lockdown, no unnecessary communication. His only task was to remain silent, remain hidden. Logic told him to stay calm, to wait time 0.95s. But logic couldn't fight the unease rising in his chest. The library's open floor plan meant there were countless places to hide, but also countless ways for someone to find him. The more he thought about it, the more the space around him seemed to shrink. The endless rows of books no longer felt like protection. They felt like traps. What if the intruder had already slipped inside? What if he wasn't truly alone? The unanswered questions weighed on him, heavy and unrelenting. And so, in that dimly lit silence, he realized the most terrifying part wasn't the announcement itself. It was not knowing whether the threat was outside the walls or already moving quietly between the shelves. The library grew darker as he switched off the lights, hoping that shadows would conceal him. At first, silence returned, thick and pressing, and he almost convinced himself that nothing would happen. But then, from somewhere within the maze of shelves, a book slipped and hit the floor with a sharp thud. He froze. Moments later came the slow scrape of a chair being dragged across the tile, the sound echoing far louder than it should have in the empty space. Peering carefully from behind a row of books, his heart stopped when he saw a figure. A man, dressed in a black hoodie, stood motionless in front of the librarian's desk. He wasn't rifling through drawers or searching for valuables. He was simply standing there, shoulders hunched, head tilted downward, as if listening to the silence itself. Then, without moving closer, the man spoke in a low, raspy voice. "I just need a place to hide. Don't make me angry." The words cut through him like ice. It was no longer a question of imagination. Time 0.7s. There really was someone else in the library. His mind raced. Should he stay hidden? Should he run? Or should he try to talk before he could act? His phone buzzed violently in his pocket. Against his better judgment, he glanced at the screen. A message from his friend glared back. "Be careful. The guy has a knife. He's looking for somewhere to hide." Panic surged as he looked up from the glowing screen. The man was no longer facing the desk Tim's time 0.95s. He was staring directly at him, eyes glinting under the hood, expression unreadable but terrifying in its intensity. In that instant, the young intern knew staying hidden was no longer an option. He bolted from his cover, adrenaline overriding fear, sprinting toward the emergency exit at the side of the library. The heavy door slammed open, and before the intruder could follow, strong hands grabbed him. Police officers who had been waiting outside, already alerted. Within seconds, the man was restrained. Later, the truth emerged. The stranger wasn't just anyone. He was a former student, expelled years earlier for repeated violence. The knife in his pocket confirmed the danger, but it was the look in his eyes that lingered in memory. A reminder that sometimes the past doesn't just fade away. It finds its way back, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows.